Good morning. The Lord be with you. So, do you remember how the gospel according to Matthew ends? The 11 disciples who were left after his crucifixion and resurrection, they go to Galilee to meet him for the last time. He's told them, or sent message for them to meet him there. And we hear the line, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And then that passage and the gospel itself ends with the words, and remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. I bring this up this morning because we also hear about doubt in our gospel reading for this morning, a dozen chapters before the end of Matthew. Peter tries to walk on the water to get to Jesus, and he becomes frightened and begins to sink. Jesus takes his hand and saves him and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" So the Greek verb translated as doubt here is edistasis. And these are the only two passages in the New Testament in which that verb is used. Now, I'm guessing many of you grew up thinking of doubt as a bad thing. You weren't supposed to doubt, at least when it comes to our Christian faith. Belief is good, doubt is bad, right? You shouldn't doubt, you should believe. And we tend to look at this story that we hear this morning, I think, and we think that Peter has screwed up here because he's doubted. Otherwise, he would have been able to continue to walk on the water. All right? Now, the moral to the story, we might think, is that doubt is bad. But the thing about that Greek verb, edistasis, is that it doesn't so much point to unbelief or disbelief. It suggests being of two minds, a wavering or a practical hesitation. As one scholar put it, Peter's problem was not so much a lack of intellectual conviction as the conflict between the evidence of his senses and the invitation of Jesus. Peter's game for responding to Jesus' call, he even asks for it. And he steps out of the boat. And he notices the strong wind. And he gets scared. He's frightened. And he begins to sink. The suggestion is that our fear sinks us and Jesus saves us. But with that in mind, I can't help but think of the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. Coping with a pandemic that calls on us to do some simple things for the sake of the health, safety, and well-being of people, of our neighbors in our community. Call to action, to speak up, show up, vote up, to push for racial justice as we're confronted with the misery, harm, and death wrought by racism and white supremacy. Prodded to open our minds and our hearts to people whose sexual orientation or gender identity has made them the objects of hatred, derision, and violence, physical or emotional. We are all being called to step out of the safety of the boat that we know, to respond to Jesus' command to come. Come to follow him on a path that leads to justice and righteousness. And most of us are like Peter, and we want to respond to that call. We want to do the right thing. We want to know what we can do. We're eager to take that step out of the boat. Call us into it, Jesus. And then we notice the strong wind. In other words, we come into conflict with the evidence of our senses and the invitation of Jesus. The ideal meets the real world. We see the obstacles. And maybe we just get busy with the obstacles and the things unfolding around us that we need to tend to, that we need to worry about. We also worry that we might say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, offend the very people that we're trying to help, to love as our neighbors and as fellow children of God. We may still believe with our whole hearts and minds, but we hesitate. We waver. This Jesus stuff is great, but it conflicts with the way we know the world really works and the practical things we need to tend to for our own safety and well-being. And so we too doubt. We edistasis. We are of two minds. So where does that leave us? Well, I think both stories that use the word doubt or edistasis offer us some very good news. You see, I'm thinking Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen when Peter stepped out of that boat. He knew Peter's devout heart was going to get whipped around by the storm that was unfolding around him, that real world occurrence or environment around him. And when the inevitable happens, Jesus reaches out his hand and saves Peter. And in that scene at the end of Matthew, when the disciples are worshiping and doubting, some of the disciples are worshiping and doubting. Well, Jesus sends them all out into the world, giving them the same mission, the same authority, and the same promise. I am with you always until the end of the age. Jesus does not call us out into the world to perish, to sink and drown. He calls us out in the world to live and to offer life and hope to others. As we go forth in the coming weeks and months and wrestle with some big issues in our culture and our world, we can trust that Jesus is with us, that God is with us. We do not do this alone. We go with God and we trust in Jesus. Thanks be to God. Amen.